All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. It is the episode you guys have all been waiting for. I am telling you, I cannot tell you actually how excited I am to really introduce these guests to you here today. The photos that I've been posting on social media for the past week, I am interviewing the photographer as well as the two people who are also involved in this incredible project called On the Corners of Argyle and Glenwood. Unfortunately, this book is sold out, and I just wanted to kind of preface the episode by saying that because I know everybody wants a copy of this thing. We are still, and I think the store is still working on trying to figure out how we can get more copies of this. But as of right now, it is sold out. However, that is the reason why I've been sharing as many photos as I possibly can on social media. He has given me the rights to share them with all of you guys. And so definitely check out the social media to kind of go along with this conversation. We talk about many, many really important things, such as the importance of highlighting the difficulties that the Cambodian Americans really really experienced in the 80s and the 90s. And he really puts that in photo form, which is incredible because a photo can speak 1,000 words. And a lot of people think that the journey of the refugees really ended when they got to America, but that's really not the case. A lot of these people came here and struggled so hard because they didn't have the resources to help them through the unresolved issues that they had, the PTSD, the depression, the unresolved trauma of witnessing and surviving a genocide. And all of that really was carried in them internally with kids. It's a lot. And I just feel like this part of the story is not highlighted enough. I also felt like it was very important to bring them on because we are in the process of talking about my father's journey and how he went on to build many more donut shops along the way. Well, I fully understand that not everybody has parents who had been lucky enough to fall within the donut shop community or have been lucky enough to even save up enough money to own a donut shop in some way, or are not in California and therefore have a completely different experience. So regardless, I really wanted to make sure that season 2 was about highlighting all experiences. This is just one way that I'm doing that. So without further ado, let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. Today, I have 3 very, very special guests with me. They are the ones that put together the book called On the Corners of Argyle and Glenwood. I've got the photographer here, Stuart Isett. I've also got Silong Chhun, and I've got Pete Pin, all who are which are the people who have compiled this wonderful book together. This is a photo book. I've never seen anything like this before. I found it through stalking Stuart, who follows us on social media, and going down the rabbit hole of figuring out that he made this incredible photo book of a bunch of photos of Cambodian refugees in the early years in America and really telling the story of how life really was like in the first couple years, which was not all fun and peachy and roses, but he actually captures, I think, the true essence of really what those first couple years of the experience was like. So I'm going to welcome everyone. Stuart, Silong, and Pete, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
So before we get started, why don't you guys all just do a quick introduction of yourself and what you guys really contribute to the making of this book. Stuart, we can start with you.
Okay, I'll start. So my name's Stuart Isett. I'm a photographer. I'm based in Seattle. I'm 55 years old. So this was a project I worked on in the early 1990s. I was I had spent before I started on this project. I was actually a specialist in Southeast Asian studies and was studying Thai and Cambodian history at the University of Michigan. And then moved to Chicago and decided I kind of wanted to become a photographer. So kind of transferred my knowledge and my skills and became a photographer and decided I wanted to photograph Cambodian refugees. And I was living in uptown in Chicago. And that's where a lot of the Cambodians in Chicago had settled. And they settled at this one corner called Argyle Street and Glenwood, which north-south and east-west. Two apartment
Mm-hmm.
buildings entirely filled with Cambodian refugees. And it was right near where I lived. So worked on the project for about 3 years total. And I put it out and sent it out to a bunch of places, but it never really got a lot of press. And then just kind of carried on with my life as a photographer. And moved back to
Mm-hmm.
Southeast Asia, worked a lot in Cambodia in the 90s. And 2020 rolls around, and someone reaches out to me, a British publisher who specializes in photography in Southeast Asia and Cambodia, and he
Mm-hmm.
asked if I wanted to publish it. So
So
that's when I sorry.
you never had the intention of really publishing the book until somebody reached out.
Oh, I always had the intention. It was just zero.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. You'll want to work. It was an obscure subject
Yeah.
by European and American standards. I was able to publish it a few times in Asia, actually, in Japanese magazines and a magazine in Malaysia and in Bangkok and a couple of places that knew the background story. But in the United States, no, it was very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
but when I got in 2020, when I got back to work together, that's when I wanted to reach out to Pete and Silong to help me do this and do it right, because
Mm-hmm.
they knew this experience the way that I didn't. I was always the outsider, obviously, taking the pictures. So I wanted them to help put together the pictures.
Yeah. And Silong and Pete, do you mind explaining, yeah, what were your roles in putting this book together? Silong, you can go first.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Hi, my name is Silong Chhun. I'm a refugee myself. I came to the United States in 1981. I did live in Chicago. I live here in Tacoma. And what the role I played in this book was really to weave the photos together with the narration. And it was a really highly collaborative effort. I worked with Pete Stewart and Charles Fox from Catfish Books, who was the one that really put this whole book together for us, got us together, and Stewart reached out. And yeah, I really wanted to tell the story from our experiences. As Stewart said, I would have been 10, 11, 12 during the time these photos were taken. And it was all around me. Although these photos took place in Chicago, living in Tacoma, Washington, growing up in the Salishan neighborhood, which is marginalized, the hood, right? You grew up in the hood, and these stories are really similar. They're really similar to me. So it was an honor to be able to put into words from a perspective that from a lens that I think that was relatable to a lot of us that grew up in that time.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, these photos was like a mirror to me growing up with all the folks that I see in the photos. So
Mm-hmm. And then Pete?
Yes, hello. Yes, my name is Pete Penn, and I'm a photographer based in New York. I grew up in Stockton and Long Beach. Um, and I was born in Calgary, so I consider myself one and a half generation. I came to the States when I was, a couple of years old, in '84. So obviously have no memory of time in Cambodia or in Thailand. But I always kind of questioned my place or kind of, my identity, my family's history. Um, so yeah, I met Stuart actually before I started photographing. And then when I decided to photograph, I was aware of Stuart's work. And I reached out to him. He actually wrote my letter of rec to the International Center for Photography about 12 years ago, I think, around 12 years ago, 12, 13 years ago. Um, and yeah, I mean, when I first saw Stuart's work, it was as Silong mentioned, it's a lens into a world that felt very intimate, that I, you know, understood that not that wasn't very visible to non-Cambodians. And I felt that there's lots of work that's been done on the genocide in Cambodia, and but very little in terms of looking at the refugee experience here in the States. Yeah, I think it was really, really amazing to be able to be part of it, to work with Charles, who brought us all together. I helped with the sequencing and editing. I'd actually never worked on a project like this before, where specific, I think, was up to Charles himself, who kind of really made it very collaborative. There was a lot of voices, and it was really great. The experience was really amazing, and I'm really proud of what came out of it.
And Charles is I don't have Charles here with us, but
No,
Charles.
Charles is the publisher at Catfish.
Okay.
So and he puts out these books. They're all actually about the same size. And part of the dialogue is that typically in photography, your dream as a photographer is to do like a coffee table book, $150 coffee table book. But these are not. This was small. It was a zine. It's like a high quality zine, and this too was important to as well as bringing in Silong and Pete to help me construct the book to make it accessible.
Yeah.
Not to make it some big intimidating, $150 photo book, but make it something that you could just look at like a magazine. So.
Right, and have it be digestible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
So Stuart, what were the motivations behind doing this book? I mean, I bet you there are many, many people that were living on the corner of Argyle and Glenwood, but what was it about? What was it about watching these refugees that made you take these photos in this way? Like, what were the motivations behind this?
Well, the original motivation was definitely an interest in Cambodian history. Something that I'd studied at university, and then I'd spent a little bit of time in Khao Dang and Site 2 in the late 80s. When I spent a period of time in Thailand as an academic, and so when I moved back to the States, and I'm living on the north side of Chicago, it was just very easy for me to say, I was just in the camp, I was in Site 2, and there's 200,000 Cambodians there, and then right here and a few blocks from me in Chicago, pretty much the same community, just, flash forward a few years.
Right.
So it was very easy to make, for me at least. I wanted to continue that story. I was like, what is happening now that these people have been through this experience of the genocide, the camps, and now they're in Chicago? And originally, I do what you do in a lot of stories like this. You go to like the Cambodian Association of Chicago, and they have a dance performance, or you go to the temple and they invite you in. But very quickly, I was much younger then. I was in my 20s, and very quickly I turned around the back of the room, and there's a bunch of guys who are like, 16, 17, 18 through 20, hanging out in the back, and looking a little awkward and shuffling around and not wanting to be there. And it was these guys who lived at the corners of Argyle and Glenwood. And I just instantly just said, these are the guys I want to focus on, because they were similar in age. And these were guys who'd born in the camps or born under the Khmer Rouge, and lived through this experience. So they were an older generation. They're all in their 40s and 50s now. But they were like, to me, everyone thinks of history as something that happened in the past, but it doesn't. It lives. It lives in the people who experienced it. And this is obviously what your podcast is about. Is this history is not something dead. It lives inside all of us. We all have the history of our families and whatever we went through. So it was, for me, it was like, okay, I'm going to spend my time on this corner photographing this community.
So how did you actually, because if you actually shuffle through this book, you can see you got real up close to some of these people. We've got like bedrooms.
Oh yeah.
We've got bathrooms. We've got all these really personal spaces. Like, how did you go about?
There's a bunch of times these guys were sleeping in my apartment too, so they went both ways. If they needed a place to crash. I studied photography. The kind of the school of photography I went to was you lived the experience. You didn't just come in, snap, 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 and leave. I mean, most of my time around these guys, Gino and Ricky and Bobby, was not photographing. It was playing basketball or driving around, or back then smoking cigarettes and driving a beer, and then taking pictures. The cameras were always kind of secondary to the experience. I didn't, and I was never, I was always very honest. I said, I'm a photographer, this is what I'm doing. And I was constantly showing them the work, and I'd make prints and show it to them so they understood what I was doing. But there was no way. It's the school of photography I went to, which is you have to live with these people and really see what's going on. An important part of the story. Sorry, and this is I'll finish on this. Was these guys were in again we're back to this word which I don't like, gang. But that's not to me all the gang represented was America. That was the U.S. side of them. That was them meeting America out in the streets. This was how they presented themselves. Whereas in the home, it was very Cambodian. So I was interested in in those two worlds.
Yeah, yeah. And so what was the time frame in terms of taking all these photos, or was it very, very organic? How long did it take for you to compile these photos? It seemed like it was something where you lived with these people. You actually lived there, right?
Yeah,
Stuart, you lived there, and how long did it take for you to kind of get all these photos together?
Well, I did it I started shooting in 91, but the bulk of them are from 1992 to 94. So it was a 2-year period. I mean, I would say 3 years, but 2 years very intensively working.
Right.
So,
right.
And it would ebb and flow, in the summers we'd be busier, I'd be busier doing it. But I'd go there on, pretty much a couple of times a week and just hang out. So, but, and I've talked with Pete and Silong, and some of these pictures, you see these little kids in the back of the room. Well, that would have been Pete and Silong. Who are just a generation behind, and it's an amazing difference between the guys I was working with, who are still very Khmer. When I still talk to some of them, they're still whereas Pete and Silong are just, to me, are very enculturated in the United States. So it was a very fine line in between kind of late 80s and early 90s for these guys.
Yeah. And Silong and Pete, I mean, I can only imagine how you guys must have felt to be approached by Stuart with this kind of project to compile together, but not only look at these photos and feel like you are taken back to a flashback of your childhood. Did it feel that way? How did it feel?
I just want to say, I mean, quickly though, that there's a sense when I first looked at them, I was thinking, oh wow, because my experience at that time I was in Stockton, and if I looked at a lot of the pictures that Stuart was making in Chicago, that they all felt very familiar to me, irrespective of the fact that and I think there's this commonality of that being Khmer, regardless if you're in Philadelphia or Lowell or Stockton or Chicago or so, that the spaces, interior spaces, the family and stuff like that all felt very, very familiar. And then also just kind of like the texture of that period too, was all very, very familiar for sure.
Yeah, I've seen these photos before I met Stuart, and it was just such an honor to be part of this project, because these photos really, for me, it's really, like I said earlier, it's like a mirror into my past and how I grew up. You look at the fashion with the sports jerseys and the beanies and the Adidas. One of my favorite photos is the love and hate tattoo on the fingers, and that on the dude's hand. And this is the environment I grew up in, and growing up, listened to a lot of rap music and hip hop, and breakdancing. It all spoke to me, and it's really I felt like I had a huge obligation to tell the story from their perspective, because the stigma, if you was to look at these photos without any context, like Stuart says, like the stigma of these men that you see, these young men and young teenagers you see that are gang members, were really the perception was that they were bad. They were the bad guys, but they were criminals, and a lot of these folks are now currently on the deportation list. So to me, this project is really important to paint a picture of what life was about. Like I want to touch on what Stuart said, when they were outside of the home, they were less Cambodian. They were trying to be more American. And in our environment, being more American meant being in a gang, right? To protect yourself and your friends and your neighborhood from bullies, because back then we used to get made fun of for not speaking English, not eating, we would bring rice and Cambodian food to school and get made fun of. We were being bullied all the time. So when Stuart said, the gang was their American side. I've never heard it framed that way before, but it's really true because we try to hold on. If you look at the weddings and the photos that takes inside of the house, it's 100% Cambodian. You're, taking a bath with a bucket. And so it was really important. And I'm really grateful for Stuart for taking these photos, because photos like if Stuart wasn't to take these photos, they wouldn't have exist outside of our own family album. So I'm very grateful to be part of this project.
Right. And I think another way to maybe put it is just kind of humanizing the refugees and kind of and their experience, right? And we talk about, I did a talk to the Bryn Mawr Asian American Community Club last week, and I did this 40-minute speech, and I talked about this experience of Cambodians, Americans being associated with gangs when it comes to their perception of the community in America. And the way that I described it was like, I think it's, you're basically taking a bunch of people who had survived what was left of a genocide and shipped them over to a third world country where they don't speak the language, they don't know the culture, they just left everything, with unresolved PTSD and depression, and you threw them into a brand new country. You're like, what, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff there to unpack, and what do you really, what do you really expect out of them? They're just people trying to live their lives and simultaneously trying to raise families. And so, there's this discussion about the word generational trauma and having that being passed down through generations. I was wondering if Silong and Pete, if you can kind of talk a little bit about that. And it's when I look at these photos, it's a word that I can feel, because you see photos of grandparents and then 17-year-olds and then babies in the background. Can you guys speak to a little bit about what generational trauma really means to you? If it's something that you feel you experience, if it's something that you feel like you feel when you look at these photos and think about your past.
Yeah, quickly, I'll just say that generational trauma is real, and we experience it here at home. What my parents carried from Cambodia to the United States really heavily affected how we settled here. There was a lot of abuse in my house, a lot of, really abusive, physically abusive, mentally abusive. Imagine young parents coming to the United States and not knowing a language, trying to survive, finding odd jobs, mowing lawns. We worked in the strawberry field, the farms a lot here. And I think a lot of that trauma gets passed on literally too as well, not just figuratively. And I think what I took from that, to me personally, I kind of when I got older and learned about the Khmer Rouge and the war, because when you were a little kid, you didn't really know. You just thought that's how a family is supposed to be raised. But once I learned what my parents went through, how to get us to the United States, I became a lot more forgiving. And then my parents, we don't talk about it much, just probably the same way they don't talk about their experience. Because I was lucky enough to have both my parents come to the United States as refugees, so that I'm grateful for that. But when we first got here, there's a lot of things that that I went through as a child that no child should or anybody should go through. So that's my experience with it, and I just try to do better every day with my kids and try to be more compassionate and more show more empathy towards my parents too. So because they did what they can with what they had.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this, and I've as I mentioned, I'm a photographer myself too, and I've been actually photographing, at least attempting to photograph, with the focus on that, specifically generational trauma, and that came out of kind of my own personal experiences and the things that I've seen, lived through, and these deep questions that I've had, it's something that you can't really put a pulse on, right? You can't really fully fully understand or know, especially if your family and your community, if everyone is in some way or another suffering, um, but it just feels normal. It's just normal. This is just the way it is. It's just the way my family is. It's just the way things are. Um, so it's like it took me until my early mid 20s to really, really kind of even get an understanding of my family, and what they went through, but then more importantly, how it impacted them and how it impacted, my childhood and experiences that I had. And all this to say that that it's. I mean, till this day, right? It's things that to say that is real is a given, right? But it's hard to articulate, right? It's really hard to articulate. It's hard to. It's like this. It's in the shadows,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, just so how do you talk about it? What is it? What does it mean? These are all big questions, and I think that it falls on our generation, one and a half, second generation, third generation Khmer Americans, and a lot of work. A lot of people are doing this, artistically, creatively, and in the community in terms of asking these really important questions, and framing that narrative. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was interesting hearing Silong saying, I haven't heard him say this before, about forgiving your parents, which
Yeah.
I've actually never heard that from younger generation Cambodians, because that's typically not how things work. But it's interesting hearing you putting it that way.
Yeah, I mean, because my childhood wasn't a bad childhood. My parents were great parents, but they were dealing with what they're dealing with. Um, I have a lot of friends that experienced abuse in the home too. Getting beat or getting whooped as a child was the form of pretty normal, accepted, forms of disciplines for any kids. But there's there's a difference between getting spanked and a physical or child abuse. you know. But that's something I have to unpack, and yeah, it's something I come to terms with. I have to be at peace with that, so I can, you know, continue to let my dad know that I still love him despite all that, all that trauma that he went through, and the trauma that that was in our household because of it. So there's no for me, the way I see it from my perspective, I can't blame him as a person or as my father. It's just circumstances of the whole situation that happened that that was the cause of it, and that's how I move forward and be at peace.
Yeah, I 100% relate to everything that you guys mentioned, and talking about like forgiving your parents. And one of the goals of this podcast, at the very least, is to ask these really, really important questions and start discussions within the second generation community, because at this point, everybody's eager to learn. And one of my goals with the podcast really is, if I can get everybody to really understand and listen to this podcast, and listen to the struggles that our parents actually lived through, maybe then we would have an understanding, a deeper understanding, and a deeper sense of empathy for them. Like, oh, that's what they lived through. Okay, maybe that would give people encouragement to think, okay, I don't know if I would be able to survive that either, and I it's okay. Like, I forgive you, and it's a discussion that I'm starting, and I think even just this piece of work right here, Stuart, again bringing it back to you, like it's one spotlight into our past that you are giving light and shedding light upon. And so, do you remember during this time, what were the common themes, what were the common issues that you felt like you overall saw within your time frame of taking these photos within the refugees? What were the things that they were struggling with the most?
From my perspective, at the time, I probably didn't think of it as trauma. But, I think over the years, I realized, yes, that's what I was looking at. and it comes through this conversation. I sent you this photograph earlier. This one picture. That's not in the book. It's in Chicago, but it was a very typical Cambodian evening in a house, lots of people there, and a lot of alcohol. And that's something I noticed back then. There was always a lot of drinking. And this one, everyone's having fun talking. This one older woman, grandmother, starts crying and talking in Khmer, which I don't understand, but someone's translating, about the horrors of what she lived through. And I think she was talking about family members being executed. And this room just went stony silent. And all these jaded guys who'd been going to Chicago schools and gangbangers, just like everyone had their heads down. And so that was always, there was always a subtext. I swear to God, every time you were doing something, unless you were just with the kids, but when the kids and the adults were together, you always had this subtext. And you could feel it, like the parents just kind of looking at these kids like, you don't know how lucky you have it here, type attitude. And I felt sorry for the guys because, if you particularly if you were at a certain age where you didn't actually remember the genocide, maybe you remember the camps and stuff. How do you? You're like, I imagine myself, like my parents suddenly, I'd be like, what are you talking about? My life, I'm in America now. So I always felt that tension between the guys and the parents. So and that's why I loved about your podcast, because it seemed to be an attempt to tell us your stories. A lot of the older people in these pictures sadly have died. A lot of the parents have passed away, and they passed away young. And I swear, this whole experience just took years off their lives. It. But a lot of them never got to tell these stories to these kids. And I think it would just be important within any community to have those kind of dialogues. So I appreciate you putting together the podcast the way you did.
Yeah, I just want to add on to what Stuart said about the generational divide, right? You come here and being an American, you're expected to be American, learn the language, how to navigate this country. But at the same time, you have your parents holding on to traditions, disciplining you the way Cambodians discipline their children. And I think there's a divide that we don't really talk about between my generation and our parents' generation. I don't know. I'm not speaking for a whole generation of folks, but you tend to go a little distant from your parents because your parents have these expectations of you that you can't fulfill, and you're in America. You feel like you're just what's the word here? You're not in sync with what their expectations and what your expectations are as you become more Americanized. So I think there's the generational gap was part of the reasons why a lot of the folks in the photos that you see went through the path that they went through, got in trouble with the law, drinking, smoking underage, just getting involved in these petty crimes because, what else were they supposed to do? They weren't accepted at school, they weren't accepted at home, and they just kind of feeling lost and in between. So, and then just trying to find your life, your purpose in life within that environment. It was really impossible. So we couldn't see 20, not even 5 years from where we were, just whatever happens tomorrow, whatever happens. So I just wanted to touch on that too.
I wanted to add to that point, that in terms of generational divide too, that, there's layers of trauma, right? So exactly as Student Simon was saying, that, you've got your parents and your grandparents who survived, the killing fields and multiple kind of being moved around the country and the refugee camps and time after that and coming to the States. And then you have the children who survived the streets, right? I mean, we're talking about the 80s and the 90s, a period of of just extremely violent crime, mass incarceration, and those two experiences, it wasn't as if I could explain to my dad what was happening at school or what in a way that he could understand, and there wasn't a way that he can explain to me what he lived through and experienced. So there's that tension there, and so so when I saw Stuart's photos, that was, I think that was really, I mean, for me, that was so moving also because, Stu was bringing a light on a whole different experience, a whole different kind of trauma also, that isn't really discussed.
Mhm.
I mean, and as you know, as a white American, I can only imagine being Cambodian. We've had this conversation, even today. It's not as bad today as it was, but 1990. You how many Americans even could put a Cambodia on a map? This is the country that we'd been heavily involved in. We were directly responsible for all the problems and the genocide. And so few Americans knew about this. So few Americans. The Killing Fields was a British movie. It wasn't even an American movie. It was made by British director and British producers and British money. Hung No was the and a couple other American actors were in it. But so I can only imagine what it's like to come to a country where it's like, oh, you get lumped in with Asians. This model minority story, and it's like, well, the Cambodians must have met them were farmers from Battambang. And if you go out there, it's like that's not like it's very different experience than any other coming to even it's in some ways very different from the Vietnamese experience because of the genocide. Mm-hmm. But I can only imagine you guys as kids, you kind of get lumped in this Asian category, and it's like, well, that doesn't make sense because having spent in Asia, you realize no, you're talking about many different societies and different experiences.
We got called Chinese all the time. We was Chinese.
I can only imagine. Yeah.
And so, Stuart, when you were taking these photos, as you're listening to Pete and Silong talk about this right now, was that a part of your awareness at all when you were taking those photos?
Oh yeah,
you mentioned
very much so. Yeah, the fact that Cambodia was a uniquely awful moment in U.S. political foreign policy. Mm-hmm. It was one of the great moral failings of our country. What happened? I mean, Vietnam obviously was too. The Vietnam War was too. But I think there's a lot more complicated conversations about what happened in Vietnam. But Cambodia, the way it got dragged into that experience, what we did to that country, how we abandoned that country, it's one of the great moral failures of this country. But it's a country back then, 7 million people, half the size of Connecticut. So Americans didn't even know about it. I mean, the famous book on Cambodian history is called Sideshow, where it was literally a sideshow. People forget that the shootings at Kent State, where the 4 American college students, were not about the Vietnam War. That was about the invasion of Cambodia by the U.S. military. Mm-hmm. That's what they were protesting. But most people would think, oh, no, that was the Vietnam War. It was just an anti-Vietnam War. So I don't know why I found the Cambodian story more compelling, say, than the Vietnam War experience story. I think part of it had to do with the movie The Killing Fields, which I think was just, at the time, I haven't seen it in a long time, I think was a profoundly moving movie, and explaining the moral failings of my country. So that's what led me to focus on this, what is ostensibly a very small community. Mm-hmm. But mm-hmm. That's where you should go. Sometimes I think as a journalist or a photographer writer, don't go for the big story. You find the little story that tells you more, and that I think the Cambodian story tells us more about the failings of the United States than other countries. Although we always seem to be repeating ourselves. So.
I want to dive in. You kind of touched on it a little bit, but the hardest photo that it was for you to take, Stuart, what was the hardest photo? I think you were kind of getting into it with the grandma, if I'm not I'm not mistaken. Was that the hardest photo? Can you walk us through that experience and that?
Hardest in the sense that I just very specifically remember that moment. It was this moment at the party when this grandmother just started crying and retelling horror stories, but it was after a lot of drinking, and this happened repeatedly. After 2 years of the community, I went to Bakersfield, I went to Long Beach, I went all over Illinois, Cambodian communities. There Cambodia. Every time you went, if there were adult, like the parents and the adults, and there was alcohol flowing, this would happen. They would invariably, there would just be this moment, and just the silence came over the room, and I knew. Not from experience, but just I knew what was going on. because I was an outsider. You could even as an outsider, you could just tell this was trauma. But there were no therapists. There was nobody for this poor woman to talk to. Just not. It wasn't on their map. So they were crying. Then there would be silence, and everybody would go back to partying. And the worst part is they'd come up to me and apologize to me. This happened a bunch of times because I was seen as a guest, and they would be like, "Well, we're really sorry to ruin the party like this." And I'm going, and my attitude was always like, "Well, this is her actual lived experience." So, but yeah, so that picture it wasn't hard to take. It was just one frame, and I stopped. But it was just one of those moments I really remember.
And that happened many times. It
happened. I wouldn't always photograph it. I think I just was just sitting in the right place. And was probably about to take. There was actually a father and his daughter there. I think there's a couple of frames of them when this happened, so I could, because it's very intrusive, and I was using flash, so. I wasn't going to get my camera in people's faces when they were suffering. That was not the purpose of this project. But it happened right in front of me, so I did it. Yeah, but you've seen most of the pictures. Most of the pictures, to me, I wouldn't say they're joyous. But as I said, it was just these guys attempting to live in this world in the United States and struggling through with it. And I played down. I didn't want to get. There was violence. There was stupid. There was things that went wrong, but that's not what I was interested in.
Yeah, there's another photo that you shared with me. It's of a guy in Bakersfield who was a member of the Asian Boys, I believe.
Yeah.
Right. How did you get that photo?
So one of you'll see him in the book. Gino. Where do I put my book down? I'll pick it up. So Gino, who I'm still in touch with, he lives up in Illinois, lived in the corner, and actually an apartment that overlooked the corner. So his place was kind of the place where everybody hung out. That's Gino right there in the middle, giving the tattoo. But Gino, so he was living there with his sister. Gino was from Long Beach and Bakersfield, and he got shot in Bakersfield. And his parents said, "No, out of here," and they sent him to Chicago to live with his sister. So I went back with Gino in 1993, and he was a member of the gang. So he just introduced me to them. We went to Long Beach. We didn't spend a lot of time in Long Beach. Spent more time in Bakersfield.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, I was really shocked in Bakersfield because in Chicago the families are poor, but in Bakersfield, man, it was rough. They were living in shacks, next to the fields, because a lot of them were working as agricultural workers, and it was rough. I was actually, compared to what was going on in Chicago, I was a little shocked. So anyway, so Gino was my introduction to these guys, and that was the only way. You couldn't just come in off the street. You needed to be walked into a situation like that. And you don't just come in and go bang, 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 start taking pictures. I would have the cameras there so they know what I'm doing. And there's a few guys that made it very clear to me that if I took their picture, it's just not going to happen, and I didn't. And I would respect their boundaries.
You would say Bakersfield was the hardest and the roughest area out of all the places that you've seen?
No, because I hadn't seen enough of the Cambodian community. I'm just saying, compared to what I'd seen in Chicago, the apartments in Chicago were beat up and they weren't, poorly maintained. A lot of people, but Bakersfield was it was poor. I mean, these people who got pushed out of Long Beach in the 1990s, when you couldn't afford Long Beach, it's like in 1990, you knew it was rough. So, Silong shaking his head. He's like, so, but it was an important experience for me actually to see that, because it was like, oh man, and Gino would kind of take me back to, this is where it started for me, and you go, okay,
yeah.
Because I'll say just as a point, the gangs in Chicago were nowhere near. They had nowhere near the levels of violence and problems they had in California. I mean, it wasn't anywhere near comparable. So,
Stuart, I want to ask you, what did you learn from this whole experience? Would you say?
God, why do you do this stuff? I don't know. I've always believed that you can only, and I beat this into my kids, is that you can only, when you grow up as privileged as I did, you really need to step out of your bubble and hear other people's stories. Um, and it's not for political reasons. It's not so that I can take a political position or join a party or start a movement. It's just for me personally, it was very important to step out of your bubble and see and I've often described who the audience for the book was. It would have been someone like my mother, who'd never have gone out of her way to see something like this, but would have been interested in seeing it. And she sold the work at the time to experience that. So I always kind of felt that was my job, was to show this to people who hadn't experienced it, so who just didn't understand why are these Cambodian kids doing this. Well, let's take a look at the history here. Let's talk about our responsibility as the U.S. government's responsibility in creating this problem. Not Cambodia's problem, but in terms of poverty and the war and the struggle of the Cambodian community in the United States. So that was always my goal. So, and it's if it works with my mom, that's all I need to do. But the flip side of it, of course, is flash forward 25 years, and it's you guys. And as we talked before, this was the great shock of this book was everybody wanted it. We didn't print enough because the Cambodian community has changed. And that's something that you guys could obviously know more about, but it has changed so much. It's incredible. I know there's still parts of it that are struggling. But compared to what it was like 30 years ago, it's really amazing. And so putting this book together, the timing was, it was literally, so 2000 is 25 years. It's a generational, every 25 years you get a new generation. And suddenly all those little kids in the back of the room who were less traumatized by the experience and did a little better in school and, got to learn English as 3-year-olds and not as 16-year-olds, have done so much better that they can now articulate their stories. So that's kind of now it's like, yep, other people need to tell these stories.
And Silong and Pete, what do you hope that the second generation would get out of this book?
I think my hope is for the second generation to see these photos and read the words and realize that just to understand that it's a piece of the history on why they're here in the United States of America. I think maintaining our culture and traditions and trying to figure out who we are and finding our purpose or whatever, it's like finding pieces of a puzzle to put together to complete a picture. And I think Stuart's body of work and this book specifically is part of that piece of the puzzle. So hopefully they, something like this will spark more interest in that time and create more stories. I do want to bring up a film that was filmed here in Seattle called Float, the Float film that captures the 90s era. It was filmed in 2018, 2019, and I'll send you the link, Dorothy, to the film. It's a really cool film. I think that film is really close to what this book was trying to convey. It's a 20-minute short, and I'll send you the link, and maybe you could share it when you share out this podcast too. But I think that book and the film Float, it's complementary to each other.
And Pete?
Yeah. I guess I just wanted to, for the second generation, for the generation after, I think I know that there's been some difficulty in acknowledging, right, the realities of the struggle, I guess, or not even that. Not like how do I articulate that? We don't want to talk about how things were in the 80s and the 90s in the community, I think. Partly because a lot of people want to sweep that under the rug in terms of the gangs and the, and the poverty and stuff like that. But for me, I guess that is very much so part of our experience. And however complicated our histories are, that's also part of it. And I think that understanding that and understanding not only where we came from, but in our journey here, but then that first 10 or so years in America and how that struggle, how that was, I think that's very important. And so I just hope that that we don't lose that, right? That we have those conversations too. That's also an important part of our history,
I mean, this is
and it's a
partly what
unique part of our history. Yeah.
I mean, what you were commenting when you're saying, I remember showing these pictures, and even when we were working on this book, and with Money Uch here, when we were showing some of the work I was talking about, I returned and was going to Cambodia and photographing deportees, starting from 2006. And the elders in the community wanted nothing to, they just like, older folk did not want to talk about this. This is 12 years ago, 14 years ago, when the deportations picked up. And I was going back to Phnom Penh and hooking up with some of the guys there, and I was working on that project. But I felt a ton of resistance from older folks. But from the younger Cambodians, there was kind of an understanding. It was like, what the experience these guys went through is just as bad. Not okay, I want to say just as bad, but it's a form of trauma. Growing up in violence in the United States, as well as growing up under the Khmer Rouge and the Civil War and the American bombings. It's different scales, different experiences, but what these guys went through in the United States, not in Cambodia, was just as in some ways just as horrific.
Yeah.
And so it's not like Cambodian trauma ended when you landed at SeaTac at the airport. It carried on.
I just want to touch on, expand on what Stuart's talking about the elders not wanting to talk about the deportation. There was a lot of shame. There's a lot of misunderstandings because how my perspective of how our parents saw that we came here to a brand new country with brand new opportunities. The United States is supposed to be the best country in the world, and once we landed here, we were supposed to thrive. And then that was the expectations, right? And then some of these dudes you see in these photos didn't thrive. They was trying to make it. They was going through a lot of questions and struggling on how to find their place in this new world. So a lot of deportees, or the deportations that happened in the early 2000s, it was really frowned upon by the community here in the United States and Cambodia. When a lot of the first deportees that went to Cambodia had it really rough. The suicide rate amongst those individuals were really high. They got into drugs. There wasn't a really support system like there is today. So that's another trauma that we haven't talked about in the community. Being deported to a country you don't even speak the language in.
And people here losing their parents and brothers because they were sent back.
Yeah, and a lot of the folks that are being deported today are, the main breadwinners of the family and getting broken up. And you can see the results of being displaced from Cambodia because of the war, coming here, not assimilating quick enough and finding success and thriving. And it's all a loop. It's a full circle, and the United States plays a huge role in this trauma that we're going through.
Exactly. And the deportations and these guys, that's not a failure of Cambodians. That's a failure of the United States.
Absolutely.
But as you said, the community they saw it as a failure of Cambodians and their identity, as opposed to, no, that's a failure of this country. So
I just can't get over. I wish I could just make 1 million copies of this thing to just share.
Email Charles.
I will send an email to Charles. So unfortunately, it is. After all this talk, the book is not out to buy.
It's sold out. It's sold out.
It is sold. It is sold out. I think Stuart we're trying to do another rerun of some sort, but listeners, I will let you guys know if that happens.
But this work is also, and this is for your listener. If there's anyone out there working on a project, a film, anything, they just can reach out to me, and I will provide these images. I want to hear a little bit about it to make sure it's an appropriate, good fit. But these images to me they're copyrighted, and I don't want people abusing them, but I want people to use them, and right. I want them to see this kind of as a library resource. So if any of your listeners is like, I've had high schoolers say, I'm doing a paper on this. Like, go ahead, use the pictures. Yeah, we might not have copies of the book, but the pictures, I want them to be used in other ways. So let your listeners
Right.
know.
Yeah, and for sure I'm going to be posting, thank you, Stuart, for that, because I will be posting the photos on social media for our listeners to shuffle through and look through. So these photos will definitely be accessible to them and online, that people can learn from, that people can pull from, that people can check out these photos and honor that part of history. I think this whole thing about Cambodia and this whole trauma comes from the fact that these people lived through the trauma and came to a new land, and this new land treated their pain as if it was not even worthy of being put in history books. This was only 30, 40 years ago, and there's so many steps to this thing that people just don't know. People don't know about the Khmer Rouge, first of all. Tons of people who don't even know. I have listeners DMing me that were like, this is the first time I've ever heard of this. People don't know about the Khmer Rouge. People don't know about the after effects of it and how it's affecting the second generation. And we're speaking to all of that and shedding light on that. That's the whole purpose of this whole thing. So I just want to say thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Silong. Thank you, Pete, for this wonderful piece of work that you guys have put together. Yes, these photos will definitely be shared with the community, and hopefully more and more people will look at these photos and be inspired to continue moving the needle, using their creative, their minds in this whole second generation to kind of uplift, move forward and grow and heal. I think the biggest keyword we're talking about is heal. So thank you so much for your time, guys, for this time on the podcast. I appreciate you. For all the listeners who are listening, I will be again posting these photos, but be sharing the resources. Silong, you mentioned a link to a movie or a video, and I will be posting that, and I will be posting also just everybody's handles so you guys can check you guys out. Stuart, Silong, and Pete, your photos as well. So thank you again. Do you guys have any last minute words for anybody?
Just want to thank you for having us on. It's been a privilege and a fun conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, guys. All right.
Thanks again to Silong and Pete for helping with this. So.
Wasn't that lovely? I had so much fun doing this episode. I wanted to throw out there, if you guys have any other recommendations for guests that I should bring onto the podcast that you feel would be very beneficial to the rest of our listeners, please let me know. I am open to having more guests on the podcast. I already have some lined up for the future. And but if you guys have other suggestions, please let me know. All right. Thanks so much, guys. And I will catch you next week.